The late afternoon sun poured over the sprawling Hartman ranch, igniting the dry grass in shades of golden amber. Caleb Hartman sat slumped on the old wooden fence, his hat tipped low over his eyes, watching the horizon bleed into muted pinks and purples. The ranch had been quiet for months now, far too quiet for a man who had once thrived in the constant rhythm of labor and livestock. The horses wandered lazily, the cattle grazed without urgency, and the wind carried a hollow, empty sound that seemed to echo from the very walls of his home. Ever since his wife's death, Caleb had allowed the emptiness to settle in like dust on every surface. He cooked out of necessity, never for taste or pride. Meals were sparse, sometimes burned, sometimes forgotten entirely. He ate alone most nights, a plate of something lukewarm in front of him while he stared at the same spot on the wall where a photograph of his late wife had hung. Her smile seemed to mock him now, or maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks. In truth, he hadn't expected anyone, or anything, to disturb his solitude again. A sudden knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, sharp and deliberate, echoing across the quiet porch. Caleb's hand twitched toward the holster at his hip out of instinct, though he knew no one would likely come to harm him out here. The knock came again, firmer, more urgent, and a hint of hesitancy seemed woven into it. "Who's there?" Caleb called, his voice low, rough, and unused to conversation. He tried to sound commanding, but the years of loneliness had thinned that edge. A soft, slightly nervous voice replied, I was told you need a cook." Caleb blinked against the sunlight, narrowing his eyes to the figure framed in the doorway. She was a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, with a simple dress faded from frequent washing and long, loose braids that had likely taken hours to make look presentable. But what caught his attention wasn't her appearance, it was her posture. She stood tall yet careful, her shoulders squared but her hands slightly fidgeting with the strap of the small bag she carried. "Name's Clara," she said, her voice steadying as she glanced at him. "I can cook. I can clean. I can help." Caleb's gaze swept over her slowly, evaluating her as if assessing the quality of livestock. He hadn't realized how starved he had been for human presence until now. Loneliness had dulled his usual wariness, but he still carried the caution of someone who had seen too much, lost too much. And then he noticed the movement behind her. A small, hesitant hand emerged from behind Clara's leg, followed by a pair of wide, curious eyes. A little girl, no older than 8, peeked cautiously from the safety of her mother's shadow. Her dark curls framed a face that mirrored Clara's, her expression both shy and inquisitive, as if she were testing the waters of a world that might have seemed dangerous or indifferent. Caleb's chest constricted as a strange, sudden tenderness flooded through him. "You have a daughter?" he asked quietly, his voice breaking the silence like a thread stretching across a chasm. "Yes," Clara replied softly, placing a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. "This is Lily. She stays with me wherever I go. I hope that's okay." Caleb looked down at the girl. Lily's wide eyes met his for a moment, and in them, he saw something he hadn't felt in years: trust. Innocence. A spark of life that seemed almost defiant against the stillness of his lonely existence. Memories he had buried, the laughter of his wife, the tiny footsteps of a child who would never be, pricked at the edges of his heart. He swallowed hard, tasting the bitterness of grief mingled with longing. He stepped aside, motioning toward the interior of the ranch house. "Well, if you're here to cook, the kitchen's yours. But, the girl stays." His voice was cautious, but there was a softness underneath that he hadn't intended to reveal. "Yes," Clara said, relief flickering across her face. "She's part of me. I won't leave her behind." Caleb's eyes lingered on Lily as she tentatively stepped out from behind her mother, taking slow, careful steps toward the threshold. The child's hand barely brushed the doorframe as if she were afraid it might vanish, along with this new world she was stepping into. Caleb knelt slightly to meet her gaze. "Name's Caleb," he said quietly. "You gonna be alright here?" Lily hesitated, then gave the faintest nod, her lips curving into a tentative, almost imperceptible smile. Something in that small gesture cracked the last of Caleb's remaining walls. He felt a pull, deep and instinctive, as though the ranch itself had been waiting for this moment, waiting for life to return in the form of these two strangers who now stood in his doorway. "You too hungry?" he asked, his voice rough but tinged with a humor he hadn't used in months. Clara glanced at him, her lips twitching as though to reply but words faltered. "Yes, sir," she said finally, the simplicity of her response filling the room with a quiet honesty. Caleb nodded, stepping back fully now, letting them cross the threshold. "All right, then, let's see what you've got. The stove's on, and the coffee pot's working. If you need firewood, there's a stack by the back door." Clara set her bag down and exchanged a glance with Lily, who now clutched the strap of her mother's dress like an anchor. They moved with quiet purpose, Clara surveying the kitchen, mentally mapping out her tasks, while Lily explored cautiously, touching the edges of furniture, marveling at the open space and strange, unfamiliar smells. Caleb watched them, a knot of unfamiliar emotion tightening in his chest, anticipation, hope, and the faint stirring of something he had convinced himself he no longer deserved, happiness. After a long pause, he spoke again, more to himself than to them. "Been a long time since I had anyone in this house but me." His voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and added, "Welcome, then. Make yourself at home." Clara's eyes softened, a hint of gratitude shining through, and Lily's tentative smile grew just a fraction more confident. Caleb realized that in that single moment, the ranch had changed, not because of the meals they would share or the chores they would help with, but because the air itself felt lighter, filled with a presence that had been missing for far too long. He stepped away from the door, giving them space, and watched as Clara moved with quiet efficiency, unpacking her bag, assessing the kitchen. Lily followed her closely, whispering questions about the stove and the cabinets, her voice brightening as she began to feel safe. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread across his chest. For the first time in months, maybe even years, he felt that life, despite its losses, might just hold more chapters yet. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long, golden shadows across the porch, Caleb Hartman realized that sometimes a simple knock on the door could be the beginning of everything. By the following week, the ranch had transformed in ways Caleb hadn't anticipated. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now hummed with life. Clara moved through the kitchen with a natural grace, her hands skillfully chopping, stirring, and seasoning, filling the air with tantalizing aromas that made Caleb's stomach rumble in ways he hadn't felt in months. Every meal she prepared was a small miracle, and the simple act of cooking became a bridge between their worlds, hers, filled with determination and quiet resilience, and his, shadowed by grief and solitude. Lily, for her part, had claimed a corner of the living room as her own little kingdom. Crayons and sketchbooks lay scattered across the floor as she drew horses, flowers, and the sun dipping behind distant hills. She had begun to speak freely now, asking endless questions about the ranch, the horses, and even Caleb himself. Her curiosity was infectious, and Caleb found himself answering with a patience and detail he hadn't known he still possessed. He showed her how to feed the chickens without startling them, how to gather eggs safely, and even how to identify which herbs in the garden were edible. Each lesson was met with wide-eyed wonder, and each question she asked forced him to revisit the world through her eyes, a world that was brighter, more immediate, and filled with possibility. One evening, as the sky burned in shades of orange, pink, and violet, Caleb found Clara standing by the kitchen window, drying her hands on a dish towel. Lily was curled up on the floor nearby, absorbed in her coloring, her small tongue peeking out in concentration. The sun slanted through the window, catching in Clara's hair and making it gleam like spun copper. Caleb hesitated for a moment, drinking in the sight, noticing how natural she seemed in this space, how alive the house had become with her presence. "You've got a good rhythm here," he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice was rough, but there was a warmth beneath it that Clara recognized instantly. "Better than I ever did." Clara offered a small, almost shy smile, her eyes meeting his briefly before darting back to the drying towel. "I just wanted to help," she said softly. "And, it feels like home here." The words lingered between them. Caleb cleared his throat, searching for the right response, and found himself at a loss. He wasn't used to expressing thoughts beyond the practical, the necessary. "Home," he echoed, almost to himself. "I haven't felt like this in a long time." Clara's hand trembled slightly as she set the towel down and took a small step closer. "I think we can all be home," she said, her voice quiet, vulnerable, yet full of conviction. Caleb glanced at Lily, who had paused her coloring and was now watching them with a curious, almost perceptive gaze. The girl's dark eyes seemed to see everything, unclouded by adult fears or hesitation. She tilted her head slightly, as if sensing that something important was unfolding. Caleb realized that the warmth spreading through him was not just for Clara, it was for both of them. Protecting, nurturing, and caring for them had become a responsibility he welcomed without hesitation. As twilight deepened, the two of them moved into the living room, where the soft glow of the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls. Lily had fallen asleep at the foot of the couch, clutching a worn stuffed animal, and the peaceful rise and fall of her chest filled the room with quiet comfort. Caleb and Clara sat nearby, sharing a mug of steaming coffee, the rich aroma mingling with the lingering scent of dinner. "You didn't have to come," Caleb said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, carrying more weight than he intended. Clara shook her head, her gaze fixed on the fire. "But I did. And neither of us could stay alone forever." Her voice was steady, but there was a trace of emotion she couldn't fully conceal. For a moment, they sat in silence, listening to the soft crackle of the flames and the distant wind sweeping across the ranch. Caleb found himself staring into the fire, his mind replaying the weeks that had passed, the first hesitant steps Clara and Lily had taken into his life, the laughter and chatter that had replaced the oppressive silence, and the meals that had begun to taste like warmth, not mere sustenance. "You've changed the house," Caleb said finally, almost shyly. "I didn't realize how empty it was until you got here." Clara looked up, meeting his gaze with a steady, quiet intensity. "Sometimes we don't know how much we need something until it appears," she said softly. "Sometimes the emptiness makes room for whatever comes next." Caleb swallowed hard, the weight of his past loss pressing against him, yet softened by the possibility of a future he hadn't dared imagine. He reached over instinctively, brushing a stray curl from Clara's face. The gesture was tender, cautious, but charged with a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding, of grief, hope, and the fragile threads of connection that could heal even the deepest wounds. The firelight danced in Clara's eyes, reflecting both warmth and a cautious vulnerability, and Caleb realized he hadn't felt this level of trust or intimacy in years. He thought of his wife and the life they had shared, the children they might have had, and then he allowed himself to think of the possibilities now, of Clara, of Lily, of a life rebuilt not on what he had lost, but on what he could nurture, protect, and grow. As night fell, the two of them moved to the porch, drawn by the quiet beauty of the starlit sky. Lily stirred slightly but remained asleep, safe in the cocoon of the home they had created together. Caleb and Clara sat side by side, the night air cool against their skin, the scent of earth and distant pine filling the space around them. "I didn't think I'd feel like this again," Caleb admitted, his voice low. "I thought, after everything, I'd just be alone forever. But now," his words faltered, caught between fear and hope. "Now you're not alone," Clara said softly, turning slightly to face him. Her hand brushed against his, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. "We're here, together. And that's enough for now." Caleb nodded, the tension in his chest easing in a way he hadn't thought possible. He looked down at Lily, still sleeping peacefully, and then back at Clara. The warmth of the fire, the quiet strength of this small family, and the possibility of new beginnings filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't known since before tragedy struck. They sat there for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one, feeling the rhythm of the night, the quiet promise of tomorrow, and the unspoken bond forming between them. For the first time in years, Caleb Hartman understood that life could still offer joy, love, and companionship, even after loss. And sometimes, it came not through grand gestures or miracles, but simply through a knock on the door, a shared meal, and the quiet presence of two souls seeking the same thing, home. By the time they returned inside, Caleb felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet determination to protect and cherish this fragile, newfound happiness. He had lost once, yes, but he had also gained a second chance at family, at laughter, at life itself. And as he watched Clara settle Lily into bed, reading softly until her eyes fluttered closed, Caleb finally allowed himself to hope. The ranch was no longer empty. It was alive, filled with the warmth of human connection, the laughter of a child, and the quiet, steady pulse of love that had begun to take root in the most unexpected of places.